Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Happy days are here again, and well, you understand that understanding a question is half of an answer, and this is, of course, Half the Answer with your hosts, Trent R. Nelson and, of course, Caitlin M. Green, and we wear a lot of hats, be it a historian, linguist, editors, over with Liberal Currents, we're bugging, but we love to have brilliant guests on, and it seems as though, much like the waters falling down the Niagara, there seems to be no stopping it. Caitlin, who have we got today?
Well, yeah, we do have an embarrassment of riches, don't we, Trent? In terms of guests. And today is no exception. I have brought you Vikas Valiveti. He's an author with Liberal Currents, and he's written a bunch of really amazing articles, the most recent of which I got to edit, so that's a privilege for me. And it was about trans women in sports and the science behind what transition does in terms of athleticism and athletic ability, because that's a conversation everyone seems to say that they want to have, and whether or not they do, we will see. So when it comes to trans rights, participation in sports has often been framed as a wedge issue. Republicans see it as a smart way to begin chipping away at the legal status of trans people, which is why even before Trump's administration, 25 states in the U.S. had passed laws that ban trans people from participating with their gender group at some level of sports. A lot of them, it's little children, like schools and stuff, which, we'll talk about whether that makes any sense. Spoiler alert, no. Today, many national collegiate and professional sports leagues have changed their rules to line up with Trump's executive order from February. Not only does the far right consider transgender athletes to be an appropriate target, people who purport to sympathize with Democrats and the left often advise that it's a losing issue. So like Gavin Newsom on his podcast said to Charlie Kirk that the Democrats are being, quote, crushed. He goes on to say, even my own friend cohort people are saying, the hell is going on? Why aren't you calling this out? When did this happen? And he points to in 2014, a law that established the legal principles that allow trans athletes in women's sports. And he says, but the issue of fairness is completely legit. So I completely align with you. The you here being Charlie Kirk, right? I completely align with you, and we've got to own that. We've got to acknowledge it, right? On rising,
we don't have to do that.
No, we don't, right? And we'll get there.
We do not have to do that.
On Rising, a both sides style two-person show where they're like, we got a person from the left, a person from the right, and they're going to talk to each other. The person on the left was Brianna Joy Gray, and she said, I do think there are folks who are trying to use this as a wedge issue to also limit the rights of trans people in other contexts. And we've seen hundreds of bills promulgated this year alone, which was 2022, I think, that go much farther than sports to try to limit the rights that trans people have under the law. So I understand why there's that defensiveness, but it does sometimes feel like dying on this particular hill is a distraction. Maybe that's too strong a word, but is one not reflective of what a lot of trans people think. And two, is an opportunity for folks who do want to ramp up antagonism for trans people to do so, because they're being made to look very kind of like overly, almost irrational in this one area. The third way, a group of centrist Democrat strategists think that trans sports hurt Harris in the election, and centrist pundits agree. Jonathan Haidt in The Atlantic said, why not stick to what I'd argue are the clearest, most important cases where trans rights must be protected, while letting go of a handful of hard-to-defend edge cases that are hurting Democrats at the polls, yielding policy outcomes that work to the detriment of trans people themselves. Kathy Young for Persuasion said, compassion is important, but a sane movement would recognize the need to protect single-sex female sports while creating equitable options for transgender people to participate in athletics. These arguments also rely on a presumption of silence from trans rights advocates over the scientific and ethical realities as they relate to trans sports participation. They keep saying that, the left won't address these issues.
Right.
Gray says, It'll be interesting to see if that conversation can be had in the mainstream without a presumption that people are antagonistic to the broader rights of trans folks. Kathy Young said it would involve open debates rather than dogma in an area of human life that is still so little understood. Seth Moulton, a Democratic representative, said the people who try to just shut down this debate, they're the ones in the end who will cause the most harm. So, in the spirit of open debate and a clear headed look at the facts, we've invited Vikas on because he knows about the biology of transition and its impact on sports performance. Vikas, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited. So we are gonna get into the details a little bit, but also I think it's important to zoom out, right? Because when people start talking about trans people in sports, they're never quite clear about who it is they're referring to, what activities they're referring to, and it leaves us kind of assuming that they're talking about a total free for all with no rules, nobody's paying any attention in every level of sports, including like the professional leagues and like the Olympics and stuff. And so it really, I think, behooves us to be a little bit more specific, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what is the situation of trans people doing sports in America? What does sports look like, and where are trans people participating?
So I would say that I think recently the Trump administration imposed an executive order banning all trans kids from participating in sports. If I'm
Mhm.
not wrong,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
what I take an issue with is because the primary purpose of sport, at least at young ages, is arguably community, physical activity, and fun rather than merely
Mhm.
competition,
Right.
right? So So this is effectively othering an already discriminated community, and for trans kids who want to participate in sport, I would say this is nothing more than like state-sanctioned child abuse. So
Yeah.
Right.
for teenagers, I think because puberty begins at adolescence, so I think there you can the kind of questions get increased. People ask more questions about that, and the same follows for colleges and for adults like for fun, for races, sports leagues, and that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. So we have a lot of different levels of sports, right? So there's the kids
Yeah,
doing kid stuff. There's the teenagers who they're older, they've learned a lot more about sports. They're playing with like their school or their like local league, right?
Right.
And you get into the situation where some of those kids are hoping to continue on to like semi-professional, professional college sports. There are stakes there for them, right?
yeah,
But also, there's throughout every level, there's community sports, there's like for fun stuff. I've participated in a fun run or two myself. Not
Of
that my
course.
times were phenomenal, but I did do it. I'm not the sportiest person in the world. Okay,
Well,
I keep.
this whole discussion really seems to center to at least some ancillary degree on this notion that like everybody who competes in a sport is of a relatively equal like ability or level already, and so to allow somebody different, it's like invading this space. And yet of course we see that there are various levels of ability in every level of sport, whether it be Pee Wee, Sunday League, college, high school, pros.
And like
What do you?
various levels of stakes, right? Like
Yes,
losing a fun run is not the same thing as like losing a spot or losing a scholarship or losing,
right,
the attention of a recruiter or whatever.
right.
yeah,
It seems ridiculous. What do you think, Vikas?
yeah. It does actually seem ridiculous because see, I can understand having a lot more restrictions for example, kind of a collegiate sport where things really matter. But for a fun run, as you said, banning trans people from participating in those sports outright, that just seems cruelty for cruelty's sake, in my opinion.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so we just recently had a story about a fencer, right? So there was in I think it was Maryland, it was called the Cherry Blossom Open. I actually have done fencing, so I have like some background knowledge. I'm
Woo!
so thrilled. Finally something I know about with sports. But basically the way that this open worked is it's actually still ongoing at time of recording. It's multiple weekends. There's lots of different events within it. There's a women's division, there's a men's division, there's a mixed division, right? And the rules of that open, because they're not part of the NCAA, is that they still are maintaining the rule that trans women are eligible to compete in the women's division, because the NCAA changed their rule to follow the Trump executive order, but that doesn't mean that like everyone did. So this, as a non-NCAA tournament, allowed trans women to participate. That included a particular trans woman who, I believe she's a college student, and so she's recently been ejected from her college team. So she went to this open, like, finally, somewhere I can be myself, right? And I'm not saying her name because she seems to not really want attention about it. So I'm going to go ahead and avoid that. But you know who really does seem to want attention is the cisgender woman who was slated to compete against her, who, instead of calling or going in the morning when the event started saying, I don't feel comfortable, which is something that she could do. It's not awesome either, but instead she went onto the strip, faced off against her transgender opponent, and took a knee, which is a forfeit. And she said, it's because you're a man and I don't feel comfortable fencing against you because you're a man, right? So and every time she talks about her in public, she uses he, him. She calls this girl a man every time, which made it hard to read because it's distracting, actually. And then, you know, she went on this whole media tour about it. She just got awarded a $5,000 award for courage from a clothing brand called XXXY Athletics, which is run by a former athlete who's like super duper publicly transphobic. And meanwhile, the record of this trans girl's fencing performance has been essentially scrubbed from the internet. Like, you cannot even find her stats anymore.
Can you imagine building an entire personality around hating other people? I mean, what we look at and we say this poor transgender woman who is being abused by brands and by individuals, and yet you think of the individuals for a second, you say, what strange, angry, sad people
well, and you talk
that you're
about
just going to abuse a person.
We talk about stakes. The stakes were zero at this. This was it was a fencing open. It was all ages. The woman, the cisgender woman who did this stunt stood to gain nothing if she won. Like, there was literally nothing on the line. She's 31 years old. She's not a collegiate athlete. She's not a professional athlete. She just fences because she likes it, right? That was my position too. I was a high school fencer. I was just doing it for fun and exercise, right? And that characterizes a lot of the participants in these opens. And yet we're walking around like, oh God, you know, she's lost so much. She's sacrificed so much to stand up for women, right?
It's like virtue signaling in literally like the most despicable way possible. Like, they're not virtues. They're vices. They're grotesque, and they're not made for society.
I remember reading somewhere that fencing used to be, you know, both genders can participate in fencing. I remember reading that somewhere. Is that true?
Oh, it still is in a lot of cases. Yeah, there's there are mixed gender events happening all the time at every level of fencing, because fencing is not a sport that requires or even really wants you to have like a lot of muscle per pound, right? What it really wants you to be is nimble. It wants you to be mentally creative. It wants you to know the rules really well, because there's 3 types of blade and they each have their own rules. So they were doing foil, which I personally hate because you end up getting thwapped on the mask a lot. And I liked epee because it's a free-for-all. You just poke anywhere you see an opening. And I don't know, that suits my it's my personality.
Vikas, why do you think that this sort of like sexist myth that like I'm competing against a quote unquote a transgender woman, I'm going to call her a man because I have no self-respect for myself, right? What is this myth that a man in any circumstance or anyone perceived as a man would have just a clear, decisive advantage in anything over a woman. We've seen this practically play out with such things like Billie Jean King beating that fella that no one can even remember his name. That's how important he was, right? But why do you think this persists still, Vikas?
I would say just misogyny and sexism is probably the most. I mean, if you remember, I think, yeah, I think in John Oliver's episode on trans athletes, he highlighted a video of Trump saying that he'll be able to beat Riley Gaines at swimming. Right?
Oh
That's like,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
yes,
He did, and Riley
yeah,
Gaines just was like, "Yeah, you so good." She's
yeah,
like a collegiate, like she's
yeah,
high ranked, right? Like compared to at least me,
yeah,
who is nothing. And Trump
yeah,
is 80 some years old.
and
Right.
not very fit.
Yeah,
If
and he's like,
yeah,
"Oh, he could beat me, or I could beat her anytime I wanted, right? Just put us in the
uh,
pool, and I'm gonna." Yeah,
yeah,
and then like even chess has a trans participation drama, right? Like chess.
yeah, chess has one, which is, I mean, the basis for that is that men and women chess, like men tend to beat women in chess, but I'm sure everyone who has done research on this knows that this is more to do with psychological factors rather
Yeah.
than male brains being superior to female brains in some aspect,
Yeah,
which
and
is like
socialization
kind of
and
outdated.
training. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they really overstated their case on the chess one for sure. And then yeah, Trump,
Yeah.
that was a weird moment for Trump.
Well, again, like you have an economy to run, bro. Like you got a literal polity
To
to keep
run
in
into the
control of.
ground, am I right? Whoop whoop.
Seriously, you think
No,
about it and you say, strange flex, man. Like, focus
yeah.
on making sure that my 401k remains
Well,
intact.
he's just
All
like
right.
gotta be the best at everything, right? So like, sure, bring a collegiate swimming athlete onto the stage and tell the country and the world that you're better at swimming than her. Why not? Like no one ever thought of swimming before I thought of it. Actually, I invented swimming. My dad is a swimming pool.
Right. Nobody was swimming before I was swimming, of course.
Yeah. And another thing, actually, back if you're going to let us go back, I think we can go back to our conversation.
Please.
I think
Yeah.
another thing that many people seem to forget when they're talking about trans people participating in sports, that male and female are not immutable properties. Maleness and female are just not immutable properties. I know this is a very common talking point brought up by the right. Right?
Yeah.
It's immutable to be a female. It's immutable to be a male. That's just not true. I mean, what does it mean to be a male or female? I mean, you can go to some Aristotelian kind of talking point saying that it's what you would have produced, if what gamete you would have produced if all things were going well, or something like that.
Right.
But practically, materially, what does it mean to be a male or female? It's just it's a set of characteristics that you have.
Yeah.
That
That's what we call the like telegenic fallacy, right? Where it's like, oh,
yeah,
it's that
Right.
your body was like designed or organized around producing a specific type of gamete. And like if you hadn't experienced some kind of anomaly that I can't always point to, maybe it's an intersex condition or maybe it's something else, then you would have been you would have grown up into somebody who produces that specific type of gamete, which
Right.
for people who really are like, what are they talking about, right? A gamete is one of the types of cells that your body makes to create a baby. So you've got your eggs in one type of person and you've got your sperm in another type of person, and those are the gametes, right? So either you have the large immotile gamete, which is your egg, and you have your small motile gamete, which is your sperm. And as a producer of large immotile gametes, I feel slighted because I am actually a person who does other things than move eggs around.
Well, right, but this whole ideology that you are going through, it reflects this notion that was prevalent once upon a time more, that the man is the active participant in the function.
Right.
Because as you said, he has
Yeah.
the
Just
motile,
because
whereas
my
you have
egg doesn't have a little cilia that moves it around, first of all, it moves anyway because the ovary moves it around, and there's like cool, crazy things about that, like that the fallopian tubes are not like actually attached, so they have to like traverse
Right.
a chasm to like get into the uterus. That's cool as hell, right? Like there's all kinds of cool things that happen in my body that I don't get credit for just because there's no tail on my egg.
Oh, that is so true. So true. The sexism and the genderism and the misogyny, because these are not new innovations anymore than transgender individuals are some type of innovation of the 1990s or 80s. How has this played out, to your knowledge, of course? How has this played out kind of across a historical sense?
Well, trans people have existed for as long as humans have existed. I mean, there have been various records of different kind of. For example, in India, there are people called hijras, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think there's. I'm not sure about the Native American term for. I think there is a term for those people, right? I think Two
Yeah, I
Spirit
mean,
or something like that. I'm not sure
there's a lot of
exactly.
different, you know,
Yeah.
with the North American continent, there's like a lot of different cultures that have existed and nations that have existed, but some of them have this idea of a two-spirit person, which is like, yeah, you've been like imbued with both kind of genders, and then there's
Right.
other versions where there's like a third sex where they're like we're our own thing, right? And
Right.
obviously there's lots of different attitudes towards those things that have like religious connotations and spiritual
Right.
connotations and social interpretations, but the through line is that there's basically no culture in the history of the world where people have said 100% of all humans are either male or female. There's like basically always some concept to make room for people who
Oh.
don't fit.
Right. And it's true, and it's like scientifically true. You can always go to the Aristotelian kind of view of thinking and say that it's what you would have produced or what you would have been on if everything was normal. So look at the teleological argument, but
Yeah.
materially, everyone is. I think Charles Darwin is the one who said that all humans are hermaphrodites on some level. I think he
Yeah,
said
right.
that at some point.
Right.
And then they were
Right.
split, right, in half, and now there's like the two halves. Yeah.
Well, that is where we transition, which pun intended, okay? This is where we
Hello.
transition to a quick story, right? Plato's two halves, his other half, right? Plato's other half actually illustrates this exact point of there is female, there is male, and then there is like something different. And the Greeks called it by the Greek name, which was androgyny, right? And that we were all at one point combined into one being, mixed of either two men or two women or androgynous, one and one. And of course, Zeus got super duper mad because they were so strong in this combined form. They were so brilliantly strong that they caused a whole bunch of turmoil. And Homer kind of writes about him in passing, but then Zeus decides that he's going to split them up. And he split us up. He cut us right in two. And all we wanted to do all day afterwards was try to get back together with our other half. And we would do that until one of us died. And then we would go on looking for another new half. And Zeus took pity on this because, well, the Greek gods, they're just like us, right? And so he got sad about that. And he was like, well, what if I make it so that they can hug one another, and I'll change the sexual organs around to the front of the body, and now they'll be able to embrace each other properly. And so the reason this story I feel is so important is because the early biblical stories had Greek translations, and these Greek stories actually speak about Adam and Eve in a similar way, right? So if we think about the story of Adam and Eve, where does Eve come from? Adam's rib. But this is really just a misogynistic way of saying that they are, in fact, one thing, split from one another. So this whole notion of singularity, of the differences and the similarities in individuals and in peoples and in gender and in sexuality, this is historically so prominent because people are not stupid. People look around and they're like, well, we're similar.
It's actually good for us to like imagine sort of universes where other things are possible, and to think about like what are the real rules of how our bodies and our sex and our gender are governed, right?
Right.
Vikas, something that you pointed out in your article that I think is really important is that in science, like even in the hard sciences, the way that sex is defined is really dependent on what the goal of the researcher is, right? And that's where we get into like operationalizing your actual variables when you want to find the answer to a question. So, like, what are some of the different ways that sex as a biological category has been discussed in human research?
Well, obviously, if you're going to look at it from a purely biological standpoint, where reproduction is like the primary goal of studying a species or an individual, it's the gametes.
Mm-hmm.
Gametes are what defines sex in that context.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to go to genetics, gametes are not so useful anymore. For example, if you're going to study a clump of flesh,
Yeah.
from the arm, what gametes are going to develop, gametes are absolutely useless in that context. You need to understand, you need to study the chromosomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for an endocrinologist, if something's wrong with the body, right? For example, if a person's sexual function is not proper, or quote unquote as it's supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to look at the hormones, right?
Yeah.
Like for an endocrinologist, hormones are a lot more important than gametes or chromosomes.
Right.
So
when it comes to doing a sport, that's about what your whole body is doing, right? So in that case, it's got to be the hormones that have the most impact on you, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So then if you take hormones, for example, medicinally, say, for example, you're trans or you're a cis person who's having a hormonal imbalance or something like that, you're going to take what's called like exogenous hormones, right? They don't come from inside your body. You're taking them as a medicine. And so there's
exogenous people, exogenous. Language means things.
Right. It means that it comes from outside of your body, but that's literally what it means. It doesn't mean that it's like some crazy other like universe of object. It is still a hormone that has been created in a lab for you to take as a medicine. And so like there's this attempt to say, well, exogenous hormones are like functionally different from endogenous hormones. And so if you take those, then somehow like you're not doing the same thing as you would be if you were like a cisgender person of the sex that would produce those hormones. So there's a few issues with that, right? One, the first one that occurs to me is that like as a cisgender woman, I do also produce testosterone and like androgens and things. Like there are things in my body that exist that you would say like, oh, that's a boy thing, that's for men, but I have them, thank you.
and there are many cis women who require estrogen, take an exogenous estrogen because of some condition they might have.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, we all maybe know people who have experienced menopause, right? And hormone therapy is a great way to help deal with the symptoms of that. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is another one where a lot of cisgender women are affected by that, and they sometimes will prescribe hormones for that, right? I don't know, maybe you know other examples.
Well, Caitlin and Vikas, I mean, doesn't it seem, insofar as the right is trying to sort of hyper-focus the definitions of some of these things, that it works in so many ways to exclude people? That's the literal function of it. If a woman is only somebody who can make babies, for example, I've heard that definition bandied about outrageously, right? Then that excludes a whole bunch of people that are certainly not under that banner, and that is unfair and clearly wild, because my mom's a lady, right? I mean, and so many other people are as well. I think, and Vikas, I'd like your thoughts on this. Does it seem to you that the Western world, the Western mindset on this is hyper focused on sort of superficial sexual characteristics?
Actually, I'm not sure about this.
Okay.
Honestly, I feel like yeah, I would say to some extent, yeah, Western society is hyperfixated on certain characteristics. Yeah,
I think it has to do with a strategic narrowing and widening of
oh yeah,
the sphere of discussion, right?
yeah, yeah,
So in this case, we're being hyper fixated on like exogenous versus endogenous hormones, for example, or which kind of gamete your body was organized around producing, right? We're getting like really
Right.
nitpicky about the stuff in a way that like doesn't reflect the reality of the world. But then also there's this like wild overstatement of cases, like for example when Donald Trump does an executive order calling it keeping men out of women's sports, but he's
Right.
also stopping little kids from participating in sports together, right? And as you pointed out in your essay, the research is pretty clear at this point about little kids of any sex or any gender not really having any intrinsic difference in their athletic ability, right? It has to do with
yeah,
socialization and like motivation and training, like
yeah.
how much you're really expected to participate in sports and how much you want to participate in sports has much more to do with your sporting ability.
Exactly. Yeah. So much of the, like I said in my essay, most of the reviewed literature of competitive age grade sports only finds quality difference, like 0 to 5% in performance depending on the sport, right?
Wow.
And most of that literature routinely characterizes that difference as minimal or non-existent, since it,
Hmm.
right, and it's also quite minimal compared to the total speed of performance among same-gender youth athletes, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
And
this is most of this is because of socialization and that kind of stuff.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think that that's important to remember, right? Like there is truly no like biological or intrinsic basis on which to separate these little kids from each other. It's
Right.
all got to do with their own individual athletic interest and ability, right?
Yeah,
So if there's a kid, whatever their gender, that's like, baseball is my life. I'm going to do baseball until I die. I play baseball every time I'm not physically forced to sit down in a classroom. That's
Right.
different from a kid who's like, baseball, who's she, right? But that doesn't have anything to do with like their body and their genes or their
Right.
gametes, God forbid.
But
yeah,
Right.
But again, you just have to remember being a child for like 5 seconds to remember that there were girls who were like really good at baseball.
Yeah.
And there were boys who were like very good at dancing, right?
Mhm.
And all of these like allegedly genderized notions
Yeah.
and concepts, they just kind of fall to the wayside when we consider that like anyone who practices anything
Yeah.
gets relatively good at it. That's the nature
Right.
of enjoying things as a human.
Well, the
yeah,
other thing that I noticed when I was reading all of these justifications for, separating these kids out is that, or, even older athletes too, is we have this tendency to forget that like a trans person has lived a different kind of a life in some senses. And so to
Right.
say that, like, well, boys and men are this way and girls and women are this way, and then to say a trans woman or a trans girl is we should just compare them always to men and boys in terms of their biology and in terms
Right.
of their physical, their sports ability and their athleticism. It doesn't really make it's a leap. It's a leap of logic, basically, to say
Right.
that I have all of these stats on how men and boys perform, and therefore trans girls and women should be treated the same way as them
yeah,
without actually checking, right? And so that's part of what you were looking into with this article as well, right? Is like, okay, let's actually talk about the actual athletic performance of trans women, um, based on the life that they have led, the way that they have been socialized, the way that their body has developed. And so I wonder if we can just spend a little bit of time talking about, like, we know that the prepubertal children are not doing much different, right, in terms of
yeah.
Right.
their body development. But like once we get into puberty, what is the actual typical process for somebody who is a trans girl? Let's say
So,
like in the ideal case, right?
So in ideal case, a trans girl would take puberty blockers
Mhm.
and then transition probably at the age of 15 or 16,
Mhm.
right? It's very hard to say that it's practically it's wrong to say that a trans girl who's taken these steps to affirm that her gender is has some kind of advantage over or a cis girl of
Yeah.
similar ability, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
so these puberty blockers, they are administered hopefully like at or before the onset of puberty, right? Like they're trying
yeah,
to
yeah. Tanner
pinpoint that.
stage 2, yeah.
Mhm.
Right.
And then once it's time to go through a puberty, and once they're considered like medically able to consent to this kind of stuff and their doctors feel like it's a good time, then they'll do the like what they call the cross-sex hormones, right? Where they'll take the estrogen and the estradiol and whatever you need to do a typically female puberty, right? So then as an athlete, you're a female athlete, right? Like you're performing at the same rates as a
Yeah,
female
yeah.
athlete. Let's say you didn't get to do the puberty blockers and the hormones right at puberty. Let's say you had to wait for whatever reason or wanted to wait until you were an adult. Um,
Right.
what does that look like in terms of athletic performance then if you're somebody who's doing a hormonal transition after their puberty?
So once you start puberty, sorry, once you start hormone replacement therapy, it takes about 2 years before your endurance and your uh, and your strength kind of normalize to cis female levels. At
Hmm.
least that's what the evidence has says so far.
Hmm.
And so after 2 years, most except for height and height correlated characteristics like like lung volume and lung size and right
Right.
Hmm.
bone size, that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
they perform identically to to the average cis female person, right?
Hmm.
And so obviously to find a problem with this, some people have come up with this advantage versus range argument. I think I touched
Hmm.
upon that in my article.
Yeah.
I
So
think I think you did too.
Yeah, so
yeah.
what is that? What's the situation with the two kind of ways of thinking about it? There's the advantage frame and then there's the range frame. What are those?
So the advantage view suggests that you know male advantage is there because they're
Mhm,
taller. That came because they're male,
mhm,
because they underwent a male puberty. So
right.
therefore, it's a male advantage.
Mhm,
Even if you like take HRT, that male advantage doesn't go away,
yeah.
right?
Right.
The range view argues that once they take HRT, their performance falls down to relatively cis female levels, so they should be allowed to participate in women's sport,
Sure.
right?
So
Right.
like
So
maybe you are on average going to be taller than a cisgender woman, but you're not
yeah,
like the tallest person to ever live. So you're
yeah,
like and you're not taller than the
Mhm.
tallest cisgender woman to ever live. So you're within range, right?
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the proponents of the advantage view basically argue that male advantage must be entirely removed, whatever that means. If you had to allow a
Yeah.
trans woman into a women's sport, even though the
Yeah.
actual advantage does not translate to a difference in athletic performance. Right.
Right.
So
Yeah, and like,
since
a basketball team, their average height is gonna be way higher than like the average cisgender
Oh,
woman's
right.
height, right? So a
exactly,
trans
yeah,
woman is gonna be somewhere in that range of like normal, basketball lady player height.
Volleyball. Right.
Yeah,
yeah.
you gotta reach over that net.
So yeah. So in my opinion, this framing of an advantage versus the range view is flawed,
Mhm,
right? Like I said in my article, right? Physically, an advantage, a variable like height does not translate to a difference in actual athletic performance, right?
Right.
mhm,
It's like saying a bigger trans woman who can do 10 push-ups has an advantage over a smaller cis woman who can also do 10 push-ups. That's basically the argument that many of these people make, right?
Right.
If
Yeah,
they're
that
not
push-up thing, I wanna dig into that a little because I read it in that, the Hilton and
Lundberg
Lundberg
paper, yeah,
article from a while back, right, that everyone was, like, freaking out about, which was it was a review article, so it goes over, like, a lot of the past stuff, but it was
Right.
clearly written by people who are like, "Let me find some reasons why trans women shouldn't get to play women's sports." And one of them was, right, like, okay, you went through the male puberty, the testosterone fueled puberty, you took some HRT, now your body has grown, you had the bone growth associated with your testosterone fueled puberty, so now you're like taller and your bone is denser.
Right.
Okay, and you've taken your HRT, but we're still not going to say that you're the same amount athletically capable if you can do the same number of push-ups as a smaller cisgender woman. We're going to say because your body is larger, all of your push-ups are harder to do. So you're actually more athletically capable than your smaller cisgender female counterpart if you can do the same number of push-ups because they were harder push-ups. So to
Right.
say that you're the same, that you're like equivalent, you should actually only be able to do a smaller amount of push-ups, and then we'll say that you're the same. And it's like, but they're push-ups. Like, can you do them or not?
yeah,
Right.
and I mean, if you're gonna, if that's the that is the standard of the advantage, by the way. So if you're gonna like,
Yeah.
if this is the standard you're gonna have, every trans woman would have to be like malnutrition to be able to participate in any sport, and that's like,
Yeah.
again, what's the point then, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
I
another
think
issue, sorry.
No,
No, I
please.
think that's really important. And like one thing that you really brought up a lot in the article that I appreciated is refocusing on what's the real question. The real question is it fair in the sport to have a trans woman there? And
Right.
so the question of like, well, can she move her potentially taller and more muscle or more bone dense body more or less is really all that matters is like, does she get to the finish line in at a speed that is faster, right?
Right.
Can she throw the hammer or whatever they do in track and field? Heck if I know, right? Can she hurl the javelin in a way that makes it an unfair advantage? It's
Right.
not, well, if we factor in her larger frame and her denser bones, then is
Right.
it fair? No, it's is it fair? Right?
Right.
So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love that you were like, no, it's about athletic ability. It's not athletic ability divided by all of these factors that we invented after the fact so that we could say
Right.
it's not fair.
yeah, exactly.
Well, again, you take this all in and you process it and you say there's a contingency on the right, most of the right, in which we do not want our young people to be on hormone blockers, puberty blockers,
Mhm.
and so in many cases these states or these individuals or these groups, they end up having children who feel a different way at a younger age and they do not respond to it, and so then they go through this process which studies that I've read have shown, of course, has psychological detriment to the individual who feels a certain way and is being forced to feel a different way, look a different way. But then when they get to the point where they now have the autonomy and the freedom to make this decision after you've stopped them from making this decision, well, now you say you cannot participate because you went through that puberty thing that we made you go through, and now you have this advantage that we cannot reconcile. And if I were a person, a transgender individual, I would feel like, well, you stopped me
Yeah.
from being able to do this type of
I
thing.
wanted to do it that way, but you wouldn't let me.
Right.
Yeah,
What am I to do? What is a person to do in this type of circumstance? It seems a torturous type of ordeal, no?
yeah, it
It
is
sounds designed to make it impossible to be
exactly.
trans, right?
Right.
That's the objective of some people on the right, it seems.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's very fair. Okay, so one of the points we really wanted to make is that sports is a cultural practice, right? So
Right.
we can talk for 100 years and you can read Vikas's amazing article about it gets into like the real nitty-gritty details of how a body works in terms of transition and in terms of sports ability. fantastic article. I know I'm the one who greenlit it, so I'm like, good job on the article I already liked. But
No, it was
really
brilliant. It was brilliant.
But also, as a cultural practice, right, we have to talk about it in terms of the biology, but also in terms of what do we want to see our culture doing, right?
Right.
So all three of us here in this chat room, we want to see trans people given the ability to participate fully in life. And that
Absolutely.
includes moving their body in sports events and getting to participate with their cohort, with their peers, with us, right? So me,
Absolutely.
I'm the cis
Absolutely.
lady in the room. I don't want to be a part of a sports practice that won't allow trans women to be with me in community as a sports doer, right?
Right.
It just doesn't work for me. And we know that participating in sports involves joining a community. It involves an improvement in your mental health.
Right.
It involves an improvement in your longevity because you're helping your body to work better. It helps your bone density, it helps your muscle, it helps your posture, it helps your heart, it helps like everything. So to exclude people from that on the basis of their gender situation, on the basis of what their body is doing, it just doesn't really make sense to me as a participant in sports as a cultural practice, right?
Yeah, and as many people have pointed it out before me, this is like this trans women in sport, this entire debate it seems, but it's a way of normalizing transphobia generally
Hmm.
speaking, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's the thin end of the wedge. But
Yes.
if you're
Right.
saying trans women aren't women in sports, I mean, you can
Yeah.
open, you can, then you can, you're opening the window to saying trans women aren't women in this aspect of
Hmm.
society. So it's like that's why I feel personally that we have to we shouldn't concede this topic to the right.
I think that's absolutely right. Like, I read all those quotes at the beginning of people who are like, well, I'm a lifelong Democrat, or like, I'm sympathetic to the left, I'm sympathetic to trans rights,
Right.
but this isn't the hill to die on, right? And it's like, well, clearly this is the thin edge, the thin end of the wedge, as you said. This is what the Republicans have tried to attack first, right? It's this, and it's like child youth transition, right?
Right.
And so this sports angle, it is exactly that. It's that they're trying to open the door to the idea and say, like, all reasonable people agree that it's just not right to say that trans girls and women are the same as cisgender women in sports. And then they kind of gloss over the science of it. They try to paint us as if we're unwilling to look at the science of it, in order to create the illusion that it's unfair to have trans women in sports. And then once
Right.
that door is open, then they're just going to look around for the next thing, right? And so that's why it kind of is the hill to die on, because we
Yes.
know that there are ways to design rules that are fair, and there are like, in all of these collegiate and professional and like Olympic level things, there are rules that prevent a person from participating in sports um, when they haven't made any moves towards transitioning medically, right? When there
Right.
are stakes, there are rules. And so to say that we're not doing that is a lie. And to say that we're not willing to look at the science is just a way to make it so that it's harder to listen to us when we do talk about the science, right?
Right.
Yeah, like you said, like these many people have said that I'm a lifelong Democrat, I'm a lifelong leftist, but this is just no, I can't stand this. This is not right. Right.
Hmm.
Many of these
Yeah.
arguments rely on this notion that trans men are physiologically identical to cis men, which is misinformed to say the least. Right? Trans women do not participate in sport without taking hormones. That's just not how
Hmm.
it works. Because so many, I've actually seen many people make arguments like, well, what if LeBron James tomorrow just decided I want to be a woman now and just start dominating women's basketball?
Yeah.
That's not how it works. That
Yeah.
just never happens, right?
And this is everywhere, right? I saw a video from it's Zuby is it's a he's a rapper, I think. But he's
Yeah,
also
British
quite
rapper, yeah.
muscular. Yeah. And
Yeah.
he filmed himself doing like a deadlift or some kind of like weightlifting move. And he's like, I just smashed the women's record. Don't worry. I identified as a woman before I did it. Right. And then underneath all the comments are like, oh my God, so brave, so stunning. You did it. Trans women really are magical. Right. And it's not just far right people either. It's people who say that they are sympathetic to trans rights and who say, you know, like Claire Lehman was in there. She found a Quillette, you know, being like, oh my God, so funny. And it's like, okay, so like that's the most extreme straw man I've ever heard, because that is simply not how it works.
Yeah, because HRT changes so many things, and for example, it changes grip strength, muscle mass, lung function, blood volume, all these things, and just pretending that people don't do that, and then just simply go and start playing in sports. It's a way of, like, it's a lie basically.
Yeah. Right. And, you know, we have trans women who are sort of ranked at all kinds of different levels in all kinds of different sports. There are very few of them, but they have shown us that there is kind of a range of ability that's consistent with the range of ability for cisgender women.
Right.
You know, they rank somewhere in the middle usually. Somebody might take a gold every once in a while, but, you know, cisgender women are taking gold all the time too. Um, and what they have done is followed the rules, and the rules are always very clearly stated ahead of time to require some kind of hormonal treatment for an amount of time that's consistent with the scientific literature. Up until now, where we have
Right.
the Trump executive orders and like the NCAA, which runs a lot of the college sports tournaments, is now saying actually there is no condition under which a trans woman can participate in a women's sport. We will not allow
Barbarism.
it. Only under they said you can do it if it's a practice, but you can't do like actual competition, right? So now today we are out of step with the scientific literature. Before that, we really weren't.
Yeah, I think we were going to talk about how mainstream media has been covering this debate. I think we didn't touch upon that.
Okay, so yeah, what it does is it presumes that no one's talking about this on the left, right? When we are, it presumes that the science is on their side when it's not, and it treats it as though it's like not the hill to die on. It's a special case. Everybody should just be reasonable and just keep trans women out of women's sports. When that just doesn't make sense scientifically. It doesn't make sense culturally. It takes on this sort of attitude of like, if a trans woman takes this spot, then it takes away a spot from a cis woman who really deserved it, which to me really evokes the like anti-affirmative action argument, right? Of like,
Right.
well, if we have the rules this way, then somebody misses out. And it's like, yeah, that's competition, dude. Like if we
Right.
have the rules in a way that's consistent with science, then we've picked the right winners, in my book, right? So
Right.
yeah, so I think when you're just like a regular person and you're hearing somebody talk about transports, the things to remember are the science is out there, people are doing it. People who think that trans women should be in sports have actually heard of the science and are interested in engaging with it, right? And that the thin edge of the wedge is not something to abandon because it is a wedge for a reason, right? So I think those are good things to remember and to sign off on. Vikas, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, please go read that article. If you're
Yes.
interested in science and biology and transition in sports, it's all in there. It's like black and white. It's pretty clear. So
Perfect.
Thanks again. This was great.
Well, Vikas, what an incredible discussion. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Always, it is just a pleasure to do this program with you, to be sure. And for all of our listeners, well, you got to remember that understanding a question is half of an answer. And this is, of course, half of the answer. And, well, until we do this thing all over again, we hope everyone has a beautiful rest of their day. We'll catch them all real soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.